The most dangerous part isn't loneliness. The most dangerous part is what created it. People think the worst thing is that someone grows up isolated, disconnected, unable to trust others. But they are wrong. The real pain was never being alone. The real pain was learning. At an age when the mind was still forming, that connection came with a price paid in silence, a price paid in self-betrayal, a price paid in becoming whoever everyone else needed them to be. Most people look at someone who prefers solitude and assume they are antisocial, broken, avoidant, fearful. But beneath that preference often lies something far darker, something invisible, something that happened long before they ever learned to explain it. Because the true horror begins when a child realizes that being themselves is unsafe, not physically unsafe, psychologically unsafe, emotionally unsafe. The moment they discover that their authentic thoughts create tension, their emotions create inconvenience, their needs create disappointment, something inside them begins to retreat, quietly, slowly, almost invisibly. And years later, everyone sees the adult sitting alone and asks the wrong question. They ask, "Why don't you like people?" When the real question is, what happened that made solitude feel safer than connection? Stay with me because what happens next changes everything. Because Chase Hughes discovered something terrifying about human behavior. The mind never adapts randomly. Every pattern exists for a reason. Every defense mechanism was once a survival strategy. Every wall was once a shield. And according to Hughes, the behaviors we display as adults often reveal the environments we survived as children. What looks like independence can actually be adaptation. What looks like emotional distance can actually be protection. What looks like coldness can actually be accumulated pain frozen into structure. According to Jungian psychology, the psyche is always seeking equilibrium. What is denied in one area emerges somewhere else. What is suppressed eventually returns. What is abandoned demands recognition. Jung called this compensation, a hidden balancing mechanism operating beneath conscious awareness. And nowhere is this more visible than in people who find peace in being alone, because many of them were not born seeking isolation. They were trained into it, conditioned into it, pushed toward it by experiences they could not understand when they were young. Imagine a child walking through an emotional minefield. Every conversation requires caution. Every feeling requires permission. Every need feels excessive. Every mistake feels dangerous. So they become observers. They scan faces, monitor moods, measure reactions, predict outcomes, not because they want to, because they have to. While other children are learning self-expression, they are learning survival. While others are discovering identity, they are studying emotional weather patterns. The room becomes their classroom, people become their curriculum, danger becomes their teacher, and without realizing it, they develop a remarkable skill, the ability to disappear, not physically, psychologically. They learn how to make themselves smaller, quieter, less demanding, less visible, like a signal slowly fading into static, like a candle deliberately dimming its own flame. Because every time they shine too brightly, something painful happens: criticism, rejection, dismissal, conflict, humiliation. The mind notices patterns, and eventually it reaches a conclusion, a devastating conclusion. Being yourself is risky, so they begin constructing a version of themselves designed for acceptance, a version optimized for peace, a version built around everyone else's needs. And this is where the silent suffering begins. Year after year, they become emotional shock absorbers, absorbing tension, absorbing disappointment, absorbing frustration, absorbing pain that was never theirs to carry. They become a sponge for emotions, a container for everyone else's storms. The family peacekeeper, the emotional caretaker, the reliable listener, the forgiving one, the understanding one, the one who never asks for too much. And because they become so skilled at carrying burdens, people stop noticing the weight. Nobody asks how heavy it is. Nobody asks what it costs. Nobody asks how much of themselves they've sacrificed to keep everyone comfortable. They simply continue giving and giving and giving until they no longer know where other people end and they begin. Their identity becomes a bridge. But bridges are never meant to carry infinite weight. Eventually they crack. Eventually they weaken. Eventually they collapse. Yet even then, they continue because self-abandonment has become familiar. They stay in relationships that drain them, friendships that exploit them, environments that exhaust them. They forgive what should not be forgiven, excuse what should not be excused, tolerate what should not be tolerated, like pouring water into a broken well, like filling a bucket with no bottom. No matter how much they give, it is never enough. And deep inside, something begins accumulating. Not hatred, not resentment, awareness, quiet awareness, the kind that grows in darkness, the kind that waits, the kind that watches, because the human psyche can endure extraordinary amounts of pain. But eventually it reaches a threshold, a line, a limit, a point beyond which continuation becomes impossible. Hughes understood something unsettling. The mind often changes long before behavior changes. Externally, the person may appear the same, still smiling, still helping, still accommodating, still patient. But internally, tectonic plates are shifting. Entire psychological landscapes are rearranging themselves beneath the surface. The transformation begins silently, like ice forming across a lake, invisible at first, then suddenly everywhere. And one day, the breaking point arrives, not with shouting, not with tears, not with confrontation. That is what makes it so terrifying. Because when most people imagine a breaking point, they imagine an explosion. The real ones rarely look like that. The real ones happen in silence. A sentence is spoken, a betrayal occurs, a disappointment repeats itself one final time, and somewhere deep inside, a switch flips instantly, cleanly, irreversibly. The receiver shuts down, the signal disappears, the bridge collapses, not dramatically, quietly, like a lock turning inside a door that will never open again. Nothing visible changes at first. They may still answer messages, still show up, still speak politely, still perform the familiar roles, but internally, the emotional contract has ended. The investment is gone, the hope is gone, the illusion is gone, and that is the moment most people never understand, because from the outside it appears sudden. But from the inside, it took years. Years of neglect, years of compromise, years of self-erasure, years of carrying what was never theirs. The breaking point wasn't a moment. It was an accumulation. 1,000 tiny fractures finally becoming visible. A rubber band stretched beyond its capacity. A rope worn thin by constant tension. A fortress gate finally closing after years of invasion. And once it closes, something extraordinary begins. Not destruction, transformation, because according to Jungian psychology, what has been suppressed never disappears. It waits, it gathers strength, it develops in the shadows, and eventually it returns. Jung called this shadow integration, the process of reclaiming the parts of yourself you were forced to abandon, the anger you weren't allowed to express, the boundaries you weren't allowed to enforce, the needs you weren't allowed to prioritize, the power you weren't allowed to possess. For years, these qualities lived underground, buried beneath people-pleasing, buried beneath guilt, buried beneath fear. But now they begin rising, not as monsters, as protectors. The person who once apologized for existing begins speaking clearly. The person who once begged for understanding begins setting limits. The person who once chased acceptance begins withdrawing permission. And for the first time in their life, they experience something unfamiliar, relief, because they were never exhausted by solitude. They were exhausted by self-abandonment. They were never tired of being alone. They were tired of betraying themselves to avoid it. And as the shadow emerges, something remarkable happens. They stop fearing their own strength. They stop apologizing for their own needs. They stop shrinking to fit spaces that were never designed for them. The part they feared becomes the part that saves them. The part they suppressed becomes the part that protects them. The part they abandoned becomes the foundation of who they are becoming. They didn't become cold, they became complete. And this is the moment that terrifies manipulators the most. Not anger, not confrontation, not revenge. Those things they understand, those things they know how to control, they know how to argue, they know how to provoke reactions, they know how to exploit emotions, but they do not know what to do when the emotional supply disappears, because emotional manipulation survives on access. It survives on predictable reactions. It survives on guilt, obligation, fear, hope, and unresolved attachment. The manipulator is like a fisherman casting hooks into familiar waters, For years, every hook found its target. A guilt trip produced compliance, a silent treatment produced anxiety, an apology produced forgiveness, a promise produced another chance. The pattern remained intact. The system continued functioning. But then something changes. The hook lands, and nothing bites. The guilt arrives and finds no doorway. The apology arrives and finds no audience. The emotional bait sinks into still water and disappears. This is where power begins shifting, not because the survivor becomes aggressive, because they become unavailable. There is a profound difference. Aggression still creates engagement, unavailability creates distance, and distance destroys control. The manipulator senses it immediately. Something feels different. The familiar buttons no longer work. The emotional levers no longer move anything. The invisible strings have been cut, like a puppet master suddenly discovering the marionette has walked away, like a radio tower transmitting signals into an empty field. The messages continue, but the receiver is gone. This confusion often creates escalation. The manipulator tries harder. The guilt becomes stronger. The promises become bigger. The love bombing becomes more dramatic. The accusations become more desperate. Because they believe intensity will restore access, they believe more pressure will reopen the gate. But the gate is no longer there. The entire structure has changed. The person standing before them is not the same person who once sacrificed themselves for approval. The bridge they crossed so many times has collapsed into the river below, and for the first time, they must face something they never expected: consequences. This is one of the hidden truths Hughes repeatedly emphasized. Human behavior is driven by reward systems. People repeat what works, they abandon what stops working. When manipulation stops producing results, its power begins dying, not immediately, but inevitably, like a fire slowly starving from lack of oxygen, like a parasite losing access to its host. Its survival becomes impossible. And as the manipulator loses power, something even more important happens. The survivor begins recovering theirs. At first, it feels unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable. Years of conditioning do not disappear overnight. Years of self-abandonment leave echoes. Old habits continue whispering, the urge to explain, the urge to justify, the urge to rescue, the urge to make everyone comfortable. These impulses still appear, but now something else appears with them: awareness, a calm observer, a deeper voice, a wiser presence, the part of the psyche that has finally awakened. And that awakening marks the birth of psychological immunity. Most people misunderstand immunity. They imagine becoming emotionally numb, detached from feeling, disconnected from humanity. But true psychological immunity is something entirely different. It is the ability to feel deeply without being controlled deeply. It is the ability to care without surrendering yourself. It is the ability to love without abandoning your boundaries. It is the ability to remain compassionate without becoming vulnerable to exploitation. This is where individuation begins. According to Jung, individuation is the process of becoming who you actually are, not who your family demanded, not who your trauma created, not who your fears invented, who you truly are beneath all conditioning. And for people who spent childhood adapting to emotional instability, this journey feels revolutionary, because for the first time they begin hearing their own voice. Not the voice of guilt, not the voice of fear, not the voice of obligation, their voice, the one that was buried beneath years of survival, the one that waited patiently beneath the noise, the one that never disappeared, like a lighthouse emerging through a storm, like a signal returning after years of interference, like sunlight breaking through clouds that once seemed permanent. The transformation becomes visible in subtle ways. They stop over-explaining. They stop defending every decision. They stop rehearsing conversations before they happen. They stop carrying responsibility for other people's emotions. The energy that once flowed outward begins returning home, and with that energy comes clarity, a clarity so profound it feels almost supernatural. Suddenly they recognize patterns they once missed. They recognize manipulation disguised as concern, control disguised as love, possession disguised as loyalty, dependency disguised as intimacy. The illusion shatters, and once shattered, it can never be fully restored, because awareness changes everything. You cannot unknow what you have seen. You cannot unsee the machinery once you've looked behind the curtain. This is what Jung referred to as the expansion of consciousness. And every expansion carries a price. The price is innocence. The reward is freedom. For years they believed they were responsible for fixing everyone. Now they understand they were responsible for saving themselves. For years they believed suffering was proof of love. Now they understand boundaries are proof of self-respect. For years they believed endurance was strength. Now they understand discernment is strength. The old identity begins dissolving. This process can feel frightening, because identities, even painful ones, provide familiarity, and familiarity feels safe. But Hughes understood something fascinating about transformation. Before growth feels empowering, it often feels disorienting. Before clarity feels liberating, it often feels lonely. Before freedom feels natural, it often feels unfamiliar. This is why so many people mistake awakening for loss. They believe they are becoming disconnected, when in reality they are becoming selective. They believe they are becoming cold, when in reality they are becoming conscious. They believe they are losing relationships, when in reality they are losing illusions. And those are not the same thing. Imagine a house standing open for decades, every door unlocked, every window exposed. Anyone could enter, anyone could take, anyone could leave damage behind. Now imagine that same house finally secured, doors reinforced, windows protected, boundaries established. From the outside, some people call it isolation, but that is not isolation, that is security. That is wisdom earned through experience. That is self-respect taking physical form. And with every new boundary, inner stillness grows stronger. Not excitement, not vengeance, stillness, a deep and immovable calm. The kind that comes from no longer fighting yourself. The kind that comes from radical acceptance. The kind that comes from recognizing reality exactly as it is. No denial, no fantasy, no bargaining, no desperate hope, just truth. And truth possesses a strange power. It removes confusion. It removes illusion. It removes dependency. Like a sword cutting through years of psychological fog, like fortress walls rising where empty fields once existed, like emotional armor forged in fire. Every painful experience becomes material for strength. Every betrayal becomes information. Every disappointment becomes wisdom. Every wound becomes instruction, not because suffering is beautiful, but because meaning can be extracted from suffering. And when meaning is extracted, suffering loses authority. The person who once felt trapped begins feeling sovereign. The person who once sought permission begins trusting themselves. The person who once feared rejection begins understanding something remarkable. Rejection only hurts when you reject yourself first. That realization changes everything. Because sovereignty of self is not domination over others. It is authority over your own mind, your own emotions, your own choices, your own future. No one else decides your value. No one else defines your identity. No one else determines your worth, and this realization leads to the final evolution. The stage most people misunderstand completely: indifference, not bitterness, not cruelty, not revenge, indifference, the highest form of emotional freedom, because revenge still creates attachment. Hatred still creates attachment. Obsession still creates attachment. Even resentment keeps the chain intact. Indifference breaks it completely. The manipulator is no longer feared, no longer hated, no longer studied, no longer pursued. They simply become irrelevant, and irrelevance is something control cannot survive. This is why true healing often appears cold to people who do not understand it. They expect dramatic speeches, grand confrontations, final arguments, but real transformation rarely announces itself. It quietly withdraws energy, quietly withdraws attention, quietly withdraws access, until one day there is nothing left to take. The person stops explaining, stops defending, stops convincing, stops proving, stops hoping, stops waiting. Not because they gave up, because they moved on. The emotional leash has been severed, the gates have closed, the signal has been extinguished. And beyond those gates, a new life waits, a life no longer built around survival, a life no longer organized around fear, a life no longer dependent on external validation. This is individuation. This is psychic equilibrium. This is the return to self, The child who once learned that authenticity was dangerous finally discovers a deeper truth. Authenticity was never the danger. The danger was abandoning it. The child who learned to disappear finally becomes visible. The child who learned to stay silent finally trusts their own voice. The child who believed solitude was a prison discovers it has become a sanctuary, not because people are bad, not because relationships are impossible, but because peace is no longer negotiable. And perhaps that is the most haunting truth of all. The people who prefer being alone were never running from others. Many were running toward themselves, toward the parts they lost, toward the identity they sacrificed, toward the soul that waited patiently beneath years of adaptation. What looks like distance is often reunion. What looks like withdrawal is often recovery. What looks like isolation is often transformation, because in the end, they were never losing the world. They were reclaiming themselves from it. And the silence you hear now is not emptiness. It is not loneliness. It is not defeat. It is the sound of old chains falling away. It is the sound of illusion collapsing. It is the sound of a wounded psyche becoming whole. It is the sound of a soul returning home after years of exile. They are no longer asking for permission to exist. They are no longer waiting to be understood. They are no longer waiting to be chosen. They have already chosen themselves, and that changes everything.